Good evening. Thanks for joining Gail and me for tonight's Undergraduate Research Symposium. It's always a thrill to celebrate the work of some of our outstanding graduating seniors who've engaged in original research in partnership with and through the support of our amazing faculty. Celebrating your research accomplishments is particularly meaningful to me as I think about when I was a student at Dartmouth 40-some years ago. It was then that Professors Bob Norman, Jim Baumgartner, and Joanne Hutchinson in the math department convinced me that I, as a student, had the power to make new discoveries. I credit my own undergraduate research experience for giving me the motivation and the confidence to enter a PhD program in mathematics at Caltech immediately after graduating from Dartmouth. But today is about you, our students, who have worked so hard to advance your own understanding and create new knowledge to share with the world. I'm so proud of all you've accomplished, and I'm especially proud of the adaptability and fortitude you've shown in completing your honors thesis work through all the turmoil and changes brought about by COVID-19. Despite being thrown a curveball unlike any other, you didn't let it stop you from achieving your goals. And I know I speak for all of the family and friends and faculty and staff members joining us today in saying that we are so excited to honor your research accomplishments. In a typical year, Gail and I host a series of events here at the President's House where graduating seniors who are writing an honors thesis are invited to enjoy dinner, share their work, and hear about the research other students have done in departments across campus. But due to COVID, we've changed the format a bit and are hosting these symposiums virtually so we can still have the opportunity to hear about our students' exceptional work. So let's get to it. Let's start with Sophia Koval.
Absolutely. I will pull up my presentation. All right, here we go. So hi, everybody. My name is Sophia Koval, and doing my thesis in the biology department under my advisor, George O'Toole. So today I'm going to be talking to you about the characterization and origin of the Y5BNR diguanylate cyclase system in Pseudomonas aeruginosa biofilms. Long title, but I'm going to walk you through it. So first, I want to ask what you imagine when you think about bacteria. And you probably imagine something like this. You think of a little single-celled, rod-shaped organism swimming around all by itself. But the reality is that most bacteria in nature exist as biofilms. And biofilms are collaborative microbial communities that grow on surfaces. So here, this is a microscopy image of a Pseudomonas aeruginosa biofilm growing on a pebble. You can see all the cells are clustered together, and you can see this stringy substance in between them connecting them called exopolysaccharide. And there are a lot of benefits to living as a biofilm instead of as an individual planktonic bacterium. And that includes enhanced communication and protection. And a really important aspect of biofilms is that they have an increased antimicrobial tolerance relative to single-celled bacteria. So in the O'Toole lab, we study Pseudomonas aeruginosa, which is a soil bacterium and an opportunistic pathogen. So as a healthy person with a healthy immune system, you typically don't need to worry about this bug, but there are 3 situations where they are a threat to us, and that's on burn wounds, in medical implants, and in the lungs of persons with cystic fibrosis. So this image on the right is an autopsy of a lung from someone who had cystic fibrosis, and you can see some patches in there that are those bacterial infections. And these infections are persistent. We can try to treat them with antibiotics, and we can kill some of them, but you can't get rid of them completely, and they keep coming back. So this is a really big issue medically. So if these biofilms are a threat to us, we're trying to study how we can disrupt them. And so we're going to look at how they form. So from previous research, we know that there's a second messenger called cyclic di-GMP or CDGMP, and that's in the center right here. And we know that this is a ubiquitous second messenger. It's present in a lot of biofilms, and in general, high levels of the second messenger correlate to high levels of biofilms. We also know that a certain class of enzymes called diguanylate cyclases synthesize this signaling molecule. And so we were interested, if this has some correlation to high levels of biofilm, if we knock out some diguanylate cyclases, can we reduce biofilm formation or biofilm maintenance? And so there are tons of these sorts of enzymes in the Pseudomonas aeruginosa genome. So we did a screen and we deleted one by one all these diguanylate cyclases. And what we found from that screen is there was one really interesting protein that when we deleted, it had a really interesting phenotype. And that protein is called YFIN. So we do these really cool crystal violet biofilm assays. You take liquid culture bacteria, you put it in a plastic 96 well plate, let it grow, and you can stain it with this purple stain. And that allows us to quantify how much biofilm there is. So at an early time point, the wild type and the YFIN biofilms are just about the same in terms of growth. But at a later time point, after 48 hours, we see a defect in the phenotype. The YFIN biofilm isn't growing as much, or there isn't as much present at 48 hours. And so that brings us to our next question of why is that? Is it because the bacteria are dying, or is it because they're dispersing? Because biofilms, when they're no longer happy in their environment, do allow their single-celled bacteria to disperse back into the environment. And so the way we looked at this was through some really cool microscopy work. So here are some images. The green bacteria are alive and the red ones are dead. And so we grew these biofilms on sort of glass slides for 48 hours. And you can see this reflects our previous data. There's more biofilm in the wild type than the YFIN mutant. But if you just pay attention to the red cells, the dead cells, there aren't more dead cells here than here. It's actually the contrary. And so this leads us to believe that the issue is dispersal. It's not actually death. And this is further proved by some really cool motility videos that I have for you. And so this is also where we introduce the factor of oxidative stress. So like I said, Pseudomonas has infections. It forms infections in cystic fibrosis lungs. And there's a lot of redox stress in that environment. So we know the wild type biofilms are really good at dealing with that. And so if we know this is an issue of dispersal, we know that this has to be somehow related to motility. So I'm going to play these videos for you, and I want you to look at how the bacteria are moving in the wild type and the YFIN mutant biofilms. So with our eyes, we can see that the YFIN seems to be moving more. And so this is consistent with our hypothesis so far. And so there's one more thing that we did, and we can actually parse out what type of motility is changing in these YFIN biofilms. There are a few different types of motility in bacteria. Some are more related to flagella, some are more related to pili. But the one that was really different between the wild type and the YFIN biofilms was swarm motility. And swarm motility is related to the flagella, and it's involved in the bacteria moving across surfaces. So here we took some agar plates, you drop some liquid culture on top, and you kind of just let them grow, and they'll form these really cool patterns, and this shows us swarm motility. And so these agar plates have this oxidative stress once again, and we can see really clearly in this image that the YFIN has a hyperswarming motility relative to the wild type. So in all of these experiments point to the idea that the YFIN protein is likely involved in Pseudomonas aeruginosa biofilm maintenance and their response to oxidative stress. And so this protein system is certainly worthy of more study, and knocking it out could potentially be a nice treatment to disrupt these sort of biofilm infections. Thank you.
Sophia, that was great. I didn't know biology could be so pretty. The pictures were great. So I wonder how might your findings be translated to other bacteria?
Yeah, so that's actually a second component of my project that I'm still working on. I'm looking for potential phylogenetic relationships between this specific protein that I'm looking at, YFIN, and other bacteria in the lungs, because bacteria have this really cool ability to swap genes with one another. And so it's not a sort of straight evolutionary route like it is with humans. So there are some similar protein systems that we know about. This system in particular has 3 consensus domains, so 3 domains that are found commonly through different proteins. So I'm in the process of finding those, figuring out those relationships, seeing if this was potentially gotten from another bacterium. And basically, if we find that this is a really great target, if you can disrupt this one protein, you can disrupt the biofilm formation, there's potential that that could translate to other biofilm forming bacteria.
Oh, great.
Great.
That's really neat.
Thank you, Sophia.
So
Thank
Natalie, do
you.
you want to go next?
I'd love to. Okay, I'll share my screen. Let's go. So my name is Natalie, and thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here and share my project with you. Before I go any further, this is a code that if you have the Spotify app, you can scan this code, or you can take a photo of it on your phone for anyone who's watching who wants to have the code. It will take you to a playlist, like kind of my imagined soundtrack that I imagine would play during my film. And my thesis itself is a feature film screenplay that I did in the Film and Media Studies department under the guidance of Professor Bill Phillips. And it's titled Hags. So this is actually a picture of my title page of my finished screenplay. So it is 112 pages long, which I will now recite every word to you now. Just kidding. But this is my playlist that it should, in industry standard, it equates to 1 page per minute in a screenplay. So it kind of tracks along. If you were to read my screenplay, the soundtrack would play along with it. So here I wanted to talk first about just a little bit of my inspiration and reference images that I used, reference films, when I just decided from the early onset of the project that I wanted to write a screenplay. I kind of started to examine the films that I watched, and I'd been watching a lot, especially since COVID, and I started to think about what characters I was drawn to, what films I like to watch the most. And as you can see here, there's a lot of overlapping themes of growth and friendship, leaving home, time changing, and just growing up in general. So this is one of my kind of mood boards that I started to make using Photoshop and Keynote and other Adobe Creative Cloud applications to kind of get my mind in the right place when writing my screenplay. And as you can see, a lot of these are characters. And that was another element I started to gravitate towards, was I was deciding that I wanted to write a screenplay that was character driven. So I thought I would introduce you to my 2 main characters of my screenplay, Sophie and Bee. And these are just a couple photos that I think of when I think of my characters, and they gave me a lot of inspiration in getting to know them. So Sophie is kind of the more grounded of the pair of friends. She's like the voice of reason. She kind of thinks she has her life together from the very beginning. And Bee is more of the confident, unapologetic best friend, but we all know that is the friend we want in our corner. So they kind of balance each other out in that way. And the plot of my film follows these 2 girls who are best friends. They've grown up together in the same small town, and it follows them for 4 summers following their high school graduation. So we don't see them during the school year, and they don't get to see each other because of the timing of their schedules. It works out that they'll only see each other during the summertime, back when they move into their hometown again. And I wanted to show you this screenshot because it kind of represents this visual element that I also created in my thesis of this lookbook. And it was able to like kind of provide me with more visual grounding and able to let me kind of explore my artistic vision of my script, because it was 112 pages of simply just words. So I paired it with pages like this that looked like they could be taken out of a scrapbook or out of kind of Sophie and Bee's diaries, was kind of the approach I took, so that people could kind of get a sense of my artistic vision along with my written screenplay. So here's another screenshot from my lookbook, and it kind of references another one of the core elements and themes of my screenplay, which is that I wanted us to grow with our characters, not just through them. And that's kind of why I chose that summer element, because I think it's a really interesting thing that a lot of us can relate to, is this idea of leaving home and what happens when you start to lose track of yourself and your best friends who you think are going to know you forever. And it's this kind of process of drifting away from yourself and back to yourself. And I think it's something we can all relate to, especially me as I look back, being a senior. It's been really wonderful to synthesize that kind of process of growing up. And it was also particularly interesting. Oh no, is it loading? My next slide. There it is. Okay. It's all a process. This is perfect because this is kind of my slide about like the writing process and the hiccups I've bumped into. So this was kind of my process from the beginning, was starting with a treatment where I outlined each scene of each act that I wanted to write about. And from there, I was able to kind of outline my characters and see what character arcs I wanted them to take, what developments I wanted them to have internally, externally. And this was also a really interesting part of my writing process, because typically feature film screenplays have 3 acts, but I was really set on the fact that I wanted them to have 4 summers together. So I kind of had to reinvent this 3-act structure and make it work in my 4 acts. So that's when I started my drafting process. After I had worked out the bare bones of all of the scenes, I started writing about 10 to 15 pages a week. And at the end of the week, I would send them off to my amazing advisor, and he would so kindly give me back feedback that I was able to incorporate in my revision process. So we would kind of look at it together and say, okay, these are some loose ends that were never addressed. And I was able to go back and kind of make sure that everything was tied up nicely. Or if I wanted it to be a messy ending, I would, leave it that way. And so it was really interesting to do that revision process, because it was able to help me get that screenplay into a place that I was proud of. And then I was able to kind of work it into the lookbook, where I went back to those initial mood boards we were talking about with Photoshop and draw in, well, what films does this really resemble? When I want to pitch my project to someone, what do I want them to think of? Do I want them to think of Freaks and Geeks, or do I want them to think of Boyhood, but make it about girls? So it was kind of that fun process of going through and re-examining what I had made after that process of writing it, and seeing it come to fruition. And then on the right, I just have some of the next steps that I'm imagining for my film. I've already started submitting it to film festivals, which is an exciting development. And my lookbook can serve as a pitch deck, which is kind of this idea in the film industry that if you have a screenplay, it's always nice to have proof of concept, which would be my lookbook, so that they can get a sense of my artistic vision as well as my written portfolio. And that is kind of the end of my process. And it's been wonderful to look back on it now, especially as graduation is creeping up closer. I feel like this has been a culmination of not only my education in the film department, but also kind of my education in like a masterclass in relationships, and all of the friendships I've made here. It's been wonderful to kind of look back and try to synthesize it all in a screenplay about 2 best friends.
Great. Thank you, Natalie. Very inspiring. Really quickly, you said you'd been watching a lot of movies. Who ended up being your major creative influences in writing this work?
I would say my major creative influences were definitely, I do have to say, my sister, who made a movie about 2 sisters. So that was kind of my blueprint for what it means to make a movie and write a movie about female friendship. But definitely a lot of the other filmmakers I'd been studying at Dartmouth, like Agnes Varda, and more recent, this screenshot here is from Booksmart, which is one of my favorite movies, about 2 best friends graduating. So definitely a lot of films that played with like temporal elements, and what it means to kind of grow up and grow apart. And I always am on the lookout for new film recommendations. So if anyone has any, that's great.
Thanks, Natalie.
That's great. Thank you.
Marina,
Thank you so
do you want to go next?
Yes, definitely. Thank you. Here, I'll just share my screen. I apologize. I'm just having a little bit of difficulty, but it should.
Here we go. We got it now.
Okay, is it all set?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Great, thank you so much. So my name is Marina Leo, and first I just wanted to thank President Hanlon and Gail for having me here at this research symposium, and everyone who's watching. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this presentation. And I actually just submitted my thesis to the government department this past Friday, and my thesis is titled "The Puzzle of Power Transition Theory: Why Dominant Powers Trade with Challenger States." And so my thesis is looking more closely into the dynamics between a rising power and a declining power. And to do this, I test an economic inference from power transition theory, which is a prominent theory in international relations. And looking at kind of modern world-day affairs, the US would be an example of a dominant power, while China is an example of a rising power. And even though there have been kind of military and security tensions are rising between the two powers, the US has kind of continued to trade at really high rates with China. And so this really raises the question and kind of sparks the motivation for my research is, why would a dominant power continue to trade with a rising power that poses a national security threat? And through trade with the US, they're really strengthening China's economic and military capabilities. And this is really the puzzle that my thesis seeks to better understand. So the puzzle of power transition theory is that the dominant powers sometimes continue trading with a rising power, even though that rising power threatens their national security. And so my thesis seeks to better understand kind of under what conditions do dominant powers disrupt economic interdependence with a rising state. So this could take the form of potentially raising tariffs, imposing an embargo, or an embargo on certain export items, or decreasing imports from a certain country. So over the next few slides, I'll outline firstly the theory behind power transition theory, and then secondly, kind of the puzzle that I found throughout the case studies, and lastly, variables that I offer that can help to explain why in some instances we see this puzzle that the dominant power continues trading during a power transition, and sometimes we see that the dominant power is actually able to cut off trade or impose an economic embargo. Okay, so on this slide, there are two images, and the pyramid on the left shows the principal assumption of power transition theory that the international structure is a hierarchy. And power transition theory is really rooted in the belief that stability comes from a hierarchy with one dominant power on top, which right now would be the United States. So the state at the top of the hierarchy really has, it's in their best interest to keep their primary position because they really benefit from having a big influence in the rules and norms in the international system. And then looking at the image on the right, we can see that as the challenger state becomes more powerful relative to the dominant power, these two states are on a collision course. And the rising power really, it's the growth of the rising state comes from internal development. And so it's growing at a faster rate than the dominant power. And we can see that right now in the case between the US and China, that China is growing relatively faster than the US. And so that's really what generates this growth and kind of puts China in a path where it could potentially kind of surpass the US. And so it's kind of in this overtaking region where there's a potential for military escalation. And power transition theory predicts that the dominant power will respond militarily to the rise of a challenger state. And we can see that in the case of the US and China, there's been numerous cyber espionage cases and disputes in the South China Sea. And so for my thesis, I kind of extend this implication of power transition theory, and I predict that the dominant power will respond both militarily and economically to the rising challenger state by imposing an embargo or raising tariffs or decreasing imports, that the dominant power would in some way try to disrupt economic interdependence with the rising state. And so for my thesis, I conducted 3 case studies, and I found that in 2 of the 3 case studies, the dominant power kind of did not act in this way that I would predict that power transition theory would expect. The dominant power kind of did not disrupt economic interdependence and kind of continued trading with the rising power and kind of propelling the growth of the rising power. And so the 3 power transitions that I looked at were Great Britain and Germany prior to World War I. And then secondly, the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And then lastly, present day US and China. And so for the first part of the case study, I kind of established that the dominant power and the rising power were competing militarily, that kind of first assumption of power transition theory. Again, for the first case, there was a big naval race to build battleships between Great Britain and Germany prior to World War I. And then during the Cold War, there was a massive nuclear arms race and proxy wars in the Vietnam and Korean War. And then more recently, there's cyber espionage and disputes in the South China Sea between the US and China. And so I found that in all three case studies, there were the first assumption of military competition held, and then I was kind of testing that second assumption of did the dominant power respond economically? And I only found that happened in one case. And so I highlighted there in that chart the two cases that were really where the dominant power behaved in a way that power transition theory would not expect. So then I proposed two variables to kind of offer an explanation for this variation in when the powers behave in a way that isn't explained by power transition theory. And so the first variable is the degree of interdependence. And so that really refers to kind of how reliant is the dominant power on the economy of the rising power. And so I found that for Great Britain and Germany, the two states were their economic relationship was fairly symmetrical because they relied on one another fairly symmetrically for trade. And then kind of looking at US and China, although the relationship is fairly asymmetrical, it's approaching symmetry, and especially as China has really, with the rise of China and the growth of the Chinese economy. And so kind of for the degree of interdependence there, I found that they're both quite symmetrical for Great Britain, Germany, and then US and China. And then the second variable that I proposed is the strength of domestic business interests in the rising power. So that'd be the strength of American business interests in China to see if that had a constraining factor on the dominant power's ability to kind of cut off trade with the rising power. And so overall, I found that the degree of interdependence and business interests, if interdependence is high, so kind of the two powers are nearing symmetry and business interests are quite strong in the rising power, that those factors were actually strong enough to constrain the dominant power's ability to kind of cut off trade or disrupt economic interdependence with the rising power and actually behave in a way that wasn't predicted by power transition theory. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you. What did you think were the most surprising things that you learned doing this study?
Yeah, I think something that was really surprising was just the stark difference between the Soviet Union and US and then the Great Britain and Germany case. Like between the US was quite effective and kind of imposing a very strict economic embargo for export controls, and actually was pretty influential in terms of having other European powers enforce a kind of an export control for goods going to the Soviet bloc during the Cold War. But then actually Great Britain was very different during prior to World War I and actually kind of continued to trade even 2 years kind of indirectly. Commercial interests in Great Britain continue to trade with Germany during World War I. So I found that to be very surprising, just the stark difference in terms of how the dominant power was able to kind of economically manage the rising power.
Great, thank you. That's great. Let's go to Owen.
Awesome. Thank you. Can you see my presentation?
Yep.
Mhm. Yep.
Awesome. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Owen Ritz. I'm from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I'm a double major in government and history. And first off, I want to say thank you to the other presenters and President Hanlon and Gail for the opportunity to share more about my project. I'd also like to thank my advisor, Professor Stefan Link in the history department and the entire history department for supporting me throughout this thesis process in a surprising year. I'm excited the last presentation was about trade policy, so we're warmed up. My project is called The Golden Age of Free Trade, Richard Cobden and Michel Chevalier's 19th century American Bildungsroman. So my inspiration for this project began around this time last year. I was taking a history seminar with Professor Leslie Butler entitled Debating Democracy in the 19th Century America. And one of our units focused on what Professor Butler called the travel wars, referring to a period in the 19th century when Europeans came to America for month to year-long trips. These European travelers described everything they saw. This is a time before social media, before the telegram, and they were really just commenting on everything they saw in American life, ranging from democratic institutions, social customs, and our personal habits, Charles Dickens came to America and complained about tobacco-tinged saliva and how he saw Americans bring guns to the dinner table. After reading through the footnotes of one of our class readings, I discovered that two of these men, Richard Cobden and Michel Chevalier, collaborated in the 1860 Cobden-Chevalier Treaty, which is the first free trade agreement between European countries. I actually learned about the treaty simultaneously in another class I was taking in the term, Government 5. And the treaty kickstarted what is now known as the Golden Age of Free Trade, which was a spike in most favored nations trade clauses between European nations towards the tail end of the 19th century. And as you can see here on this slide, you have Cobden and Chevalier the day before the treaty was signed posing together for this photo. But my lens into the project was focused more on their time in America and exploring how that influenced their free trade agreement. Historians haven't yet considered the impact of their time exploring America and seeing their vision of political economy unfold, which happened decades before they formulated this agreement. So the goal of my project was twofold. First, I sought to look at their travel diaries as a lens into their personal lives, but also the origins of free trade in both Europe and America at the time. And second, I sought to learn about America, both then and now, through their experience traveling in the 19th century. So just quickly to give some context on Cobden and Chevalier, my two protagonists, I'll give you a quick minute background on each. Richard Cobden was the quintessential Victorian self-made man. He was born in Manchester, became a successful entrepreneur, and was energized by the cause of free trade after he came to America in the 1830s and toured the rest of Europe. He's a famed liberal thinker in England and is known as the father of free trade. He's an iconic intellectual. On this slide, you see the maps of the two voyages he took to America in 1835 and 1859, and you also see his travel diaries, which were published in 1952 by a historian at Princeton University. Although Cobden is very well known in Britain, his contemporary collaborator, Michel Chevalier, is less known. He's sort of a man of mystery to historians even today. He had an equally important impact, though, in shaping this free trade agreement. In a span of 20 years, he went from a mining engineer who was imprisoned for being a political radical to a famed correspondent in America to Napoleon III's closest economic advisor. It's a true historical miracle in a sense that he was able to play such an important role in shaping the history of trade. Despite this interesting and exciting life, there's only been 2 books dedicated to his life and thought. So one of the goals of my project is to shed a light on just how unique his vision for political economy was. As you can see on this slide, his American voyage was also well documented, and his travel diaries were published while he was still in America, back home in France, to great acclaim. Now that you've met my 2 protagonists, I'd like to give some context on the research questions that I hope to answer. There was 3 primary questions. First, how did Cobden and Chevalier's time in America shape their personal, political, and philosophical development? Second, how did their reflections differ from their European contemporaries and shape their vision of free trade? And third, what are the contemporary implications of their treaty and their visions of political economy? To answer these questions, I first turned to the primary sources, the letters that the 2 men wrote while traveling in America. But I also combined this with secondary literature on the history of trade policy, political economy, and foreign travelers coming to Europe and America during the 19th century. The 4 main findings of my thesis are as follows. First, Cobden and Chevalier's vision of free trade was much more nuanced than ideological conceptions that paint free trade as either completely laissez-faire or imperialist or greedy. Second, Cobden and Chevalier were much more aware of and inspired by America's progress in technology, communications, and education than their European contemporaries. They had a feeling and essentially predicted that America was capable of becoming a global capitalist superpower 150 years before that was the case. Third, Cobden and Chevalier saw American political economy as evidence that state-led investment and individual economic activity were equally important drivers of economic growth. They were essentially early advocates of the developmental state, which they first saw unfolding in America. And lastly, Cobden and Chevalier's experience in America drove them to pursue free trade, not just as an economic good, but as a political tool to encourage the international community to prioritize commerce over conflict, which was a radical opinion in the 19th century, but ended up laying the foundation for the 20th century international institutions that we often take for granted, such as the UN and the EU. thanks for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
So Owen, that was awesome. Thank you. I have one question. What motivated Cobden and Chevalier to come to the U.S.? What was there about the U.S. that made them think that's where they wanted to come and learn?
Yeah, for sure. So it's interesting because there are two motivations where I think reflective of how historians have looked at kind of analyzing them to this day. So Cobden had written a public pamphlet entitled England, Ireland, and America shortly before coming to America. And he essentially in the pamphlet argued that the United States had a special combination of economic development, foreign non-intervention, and sheer will that would make it, a rising power, and that England really needed to worry about the US's growth. But he was also actually visiting his brother, who was living in the United States at the time. So it was kind of a mix of work and leisure for him. And Chevalier, it was a trip under very different circumstances. As I mentioned, he was in prison for a long time in France. And then his ticket out essentially was to come to the United States to study the railroad system. So he was actually commissioned to study America's railroads for 8 months. He ended up staying for 2 years and going far beyond that original scope. So I think the fact that they had two very separate purposes for being here, but they left with actually a pretty similar vision of what they thought America could become is an interesting thing to explore.
Great.
That's
Thanks.
great.
Thanks, Ellen. Very interesting.
Thank you.
Duncan, do you want to take
Sure
the
thing.
next one?
Okay, so today, this works, yeah. I will be talking about Izmir, specifically this title here, Gavur Izmir, National Identity Formation in Turkey's Aegean Metropolis. So why am I talking about this and what's going on in Turkey today? So Turkey today is subject to intense contestation over what it means to be Turkish. And this has been going on for the past 2 decades. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, since he took power in 2002, has increasingly sought to redefine Turkish identity on religious lines, reconnecting with the mythologized Ottoman past and trying to minimize the role of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk in the Turkish sense of self. And on the left here, we have Atatürk, and on the right, we have Erdogan in this kind of dichotomy. Now, in the face of these interventions, we've seen local leaders in Gavur Izmir, and I use that nickname, I'll explain that in a little bit. They've gone about strengthening and extending their own understanding of national identity. Now, Izmir is Turkey's 3rd largest city, and it's long been an important economic and cultural center. And why it's called Gavur is very interesting and kind of indicative of what I'll be talking about in this thesis. In the during the Ottoman Empire, Izmir was a massive cosmopolitan port. It had Venetians, Dutch, English, French, Jews, Arabs, Armenians, Greeks. And so it was kind of a melting pot of different influences. And this really affected the local population and kind of brought them into conversation with the latest developments in Europe. So it was really a cosmopolitan modern society. And Erdogan and his Islamist allies like to use this word for Izmir today because Izmir is the last bastion of secularism in Turkey. It's the stronghold of rejection of Islamist ideology. And so Islamist leaders like to call it, and Gavur means infidel in Turkish. So they call it the infidel city. Now, in studying these local political actors, we can escape the restricting narratives that we place on Turkey and other countries of all-powerful autocrats who overpower their captive populations. And through this, we can give power and agency back to local people while also broadening the studies of Turkey beyond Istanbul and Ankara, which is kind of the focus of most scholarly work. And I'll be looking today at the actions of these local actors through the lens of banal nationalism. And this is the idea that the state can be materially reproduced through things like flags, through traditions like singing the national anthem every day at school. And in my specific case, I'll be looking at statues and monuments, museums and landmarks, and fairs and festivals. So the statues and monuments, the construction of national identity in Izmir. So Izmir statues and monuments are unparalleled in their grandiosity, creativity, and visibility, as you can see in these photos. And they're really intended to reassert the centrality of Atatürk and his reforms to Turkish identity, as well as Izmirians' unwavering support behind them. So in terms of the grandiosity, you can see in this first photo here, a major silhouette on a highway. You have here a massive kind of Mount Rushmore-like bust, which is on the outskirts of Izmir, but also they're not just kind of static structures that people pass as they drive on highways. They're also structures that people engage with, and as they engage with them, they kind of reassert their connection to Ataturk. So on the bottom left here, you have an iftar dinner, which is the breaking of the Ramadan fast, taking place at the monument of Ataturk, his mother, and women's rights, which inside of it actually has a museum on the history of Turkish women and their role in furthering the nation. And this is the second women's museum in Izmir, and Izmir is the only city in Turkey that has women's museums. And then on the bottom right here, you see a small statue here, but next to it, a grand public space where we can show where political figures and forces can show their dedication to Ataturk. And in this case, they do so by forming his silhouette through their own bodies. Now, Izmir's leaders also do this through museums and landmarks and the way they narrate national identity. So Izmir's museums and landmarks are really innovative in their design and increasingly trailblazing in their content, building on the city's statues and monuments, not only to reassert the importance of the Kemalist legacy on Turkey today, but also drawing from Izmir's own past to conceive of a more progressive understanding of national identity. So in terms of the innovation, we have this first picture. This is the Ataturk Museum. Now, every city in Turkey has an Ataturk Museum, but this is the only Ataturk Museum in Turkey that actually tells a story. It tells a narrative about who Ataturk was and why he's important. And they even have in English too, which was very helpful for me in trying to parse together what narrative the leaders are trying to tell. In the top right-hand corner, we have the mansion of Ataturk's first wife, Latif Hanım. And this mansion and other museums like it tried to reinforce Ataturk's personal relationship with the city. He was not born in Turkey. He was actually born in present-day Greece. So by showing his kind of relationship with his wife, with his mother, who was also buried in Izmir, the local leaders are trying to show this kind of inalienable connection between Ataturk and Izmirians, which they should cherish and keep today in the present. Now, in terms of this new kind of progressive identity that's being constructed, we have a lot of new minority and community museums. So this bottom left, we have a Greek heritage museum about the population exchange, whereby Izmir citizens in the Ottoman Empire, the Greek citizens, were forcibly transferred to Greece in return for Turkish citizens. And this museum kind of shows the community and shared experience of both Greek and Turkish populations to kind of bridge that divide that politicians like to make between Greek Christians on the one hand and Turkish Muslims on the other. And finally, on the bottom right, we have a Jewish synagogue, which is part of this great restoration project of 9 historical synagogues in the city, which seeks to kind of increase the visibility and the cultural awareness of the city's Jewish population, which today is only 2,500. But it's kind of showing a different future, a different idea of what it means to be Turkish, showing that Jews and Muslims can be Turkish and that they can coexist together. Finally, with the fairs and festivals, this involves a performance of national identity. So this is the most participatory form of nation building, and it allows participants to actively engage in new forms of self-understanding that push the boundaries of Kemalist national identity and forge a more inclusive understanding of what it means to be Turkish. So in the top left, I have a poster from Izmir International Fair, and the caption says, "When you have a guest, drink a cocktail." So this is kind of trying to encourage the citizens in more European ways, more Christian, if you will, ways of kind of socializing. In the top right-hand corner, you see a music festival, which is taking place on the Ephesus ancient Greek ruins. And a lot of reports from people who come to these festivals say that they really, once they leave, they have a feeling that Izmir is part of a greater European cultural heritage and community, and it makes them feel as part of Europe instead of part of some Islamic world. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, we have a festival dedicated to the city's African population, which is a very, very interesting community. It's a community of slaves that were brought to Izmir by the Ottoman Empire, and it's the only city in Turkey which has a substantial Afro-Turk population. And this festival, which started 15 years ago, really seeks to increase awareness and give the Afro-Turks a voice in the Turkish story and to show that they are Turkish as well. And we see the mayor of Izmir actually participating in this festival to kind of further that notion. And finally, this Jewish festival, which was started last year, is doing the same thing, kind of showing a more inclusive understanding of Turkish identity that includes local minorities into a greater, more inclusive, more tolerant understanding of what it means to be Turkish. And so in conclusion, there's a profound ideological contest taking place across Izmir and across Turkey. But based on these initiatives, it is clear that local actors will not bow down to Erdogan's objectives and will continue to reassert their own understanding of Turkish identity, not just centered on secularism and European modernity, but also centered on more progressive national identity that is tolerant, inclusive, and focused on social justice. And this really is a groundbreaking development in Turkish socio-political history.
That was great. Thank you so much. So what I'm curious what got you interested in this topic. And then I'm also wondering if you see parallels between Ataturk's afterlife and other historical figures outside of Turkey.
Sure. So I first kind of got interested in the topic. I was visiting actually a friend from high school who moved to Izmir to play for the soccer team there. He's part Turkish. And when I arrived in the city, I don't know what I was expecting because I'd never been to a Muslim country before, but everywhere I looked, I saw Ataturk. I saw statues symbolizing women. I saw these different really kind of progressive monuments, museums, posters, and it also was reflected in the attitude of the people. Now, Izmir is known as kind of the bastion of secularism. And, you know, I see more women wearing hijab in my own neighborhood in Chicago than I saw in this city. It really is, it feels like you're part of Europe when you're there. And it really, when I went to Istanbul and later to other places in Turkey, it really struck me that there was something different going on in Izmir. So I wanted to look into why did I feel that way? And why I felt that way was the result of the different initiatives that Izmir's politicians, their civic actors are trying to create in the city. And in terms of how this can be applied to other, I think Ataturk is very unique in Turkish identity, and this is what's something that really interests me about the country is there really is no figure like Ataturk. I mean, the cult of personality, the kind of, he is just the center with which every single understanding of Turkish self can come from. Either you're rejecting him or you're supporting him, but it's impossible to ignore him. But in terms of how it can be applied to other countries, I think any polarized country with kind of a leader that divides, I think this provides a way for us to move past that, to get past that. So maybe in America, for example, Trump is this figure that is really divisive and we're either rejecting Trump or we're supporting Trump. And maybe this can help with finding ways to move past that, to rebel against that, and to create, to break down this false dichotomy and create a new sense of national identity that gives room for more unity.
Great, thank you.
So Zeke, do you want to bring us home here?
Yeah, of course. I'll go ahead and share my presentation now. Can you all see the screen there? Let's go ahead and get started. So my name is Ezekiel Vergara, and I'm majoring in government and philosophy, and my thesis is housed under the government department, and it is entitled Just and Unjust Revolutions, a Theoretical Examination of the Ethics of Revolutions. So I'll be presenting on this today. And first off, I want to thank you all for just taking the time to be here this evening. So today I make my presentation in 5 parts. So first we'll go over my main research question. Second, we'll look at the motivations behind this thesis. Third, we'll look at my methodology. Fourth, I'll give a really quick crash course on just war theory. And then fifth, I'll go over some of the conclusions that I reached in my thesis. So the overarching question that my thesis seeks to answer is the following. What does justice require of violent political revolutions? And I've included my answer on this slide, but before diving into this, I would like to address sort of the impetus behind this thesis. So why write a thesis on the ethics of revolutions out of all things? Well, a lot of reasons, but 2 reasons stand out in particular. First, my grandparents fled Cuba following the Cuban Revolution, so the topic is actually quite dear to me. Second, I find ethics, both applied and theoretical, very interesting. So these factors were sort of what pushed me to write on the ethics of revolutions. And now, our next order of business is to go over my methodology. What does a political philosopher or a philosopher do? So on the one hand, I use philosophical argumentation, which is code for just hypothetical examples, challenging premises and conclusions that other philosophers have made. And then on the other hand, I employ the method of reflective equilibrium, which is a more formalized method in philosophy. Reflective equilibrium refers to the process of bringing our specific moral intuitions and our broad moral principles into equilibrium. This is the method par excellence in applied philosophy. And it's not the most intuitive method, so I've included a graphic that sort of illustrates the process of reflective equilibrium and an example on the bottom of where we revise our general principle in respect to some of our intuitions. So with this methodology in mind, I want to go ahead and discuss what just war theory is. So oftentimes thought about war and peace is starkly dichotomized. So on the one hand, you have political realism, or the thought that anything is justified in warfare, might makes right. And then on the other hand, you have pacifism, or the thought that warfare is never justified. So between these two poles, you get just war theory, which seeks to lay out the ethical guidelines for how to act in warfare. So a rough definition that we can use here of just war theory is the following: an ethical framework that specifies when warfare is justified, how warfare is justly conducted, and how peace is established after a given war. So with this understanding of the ethics of warfare and just war theory, in my thesis, I argue that justice requires at least three things of political revolutions. First, I argue that revolutions must have a just cause, meeting a certain formal and substantive requirement. I present just cause as formally reasons-based as opposed to goal-based, which is the predominant account in the literature. Moreover, I defend various substantive just causes that might justify revolution, including self-defense, political rights violations, and lesser evil justifications. All of these, I argue, hearken to an understanding of weighty rights. Second, I argue that offensive but not defensive revolutions require a legitimate authority. This centers consent as a necessary and sufficient requirement for just revolutions, and also hearkens to a normative notion of weighty rights, which forestalls any concerns of paternalism. Third, I argue that just revolutions must respect a complex formulation of non-combatant immunity. This, I argue, rests on multiple overlapping foundations, which challenges the general philosophic trend in regard to non-combatant immunity, which seeks to find a singular factor that determines what differentiates a combatant and a non-combatant. Among the multiple overlapping foundations that I discuss in my thesis are responsibility, relevant epistemic states, vulnerability, and riskiness. And while I offer these conclusions to you all, this is sort of a first pass at my central claims. So with that, I would just like to say thank you all for your attention.
Great, thank you, Zeke. Let me put you on the spot. Do you think the American War of Independence was a just revolution?
I think it's a complicated question, and philosophers don't like to give solid answers. So I'll try my best here. I think there are two questions at stake, sort of in that one question. The first is, was the American Revolution a political revolution? I think it's sort of a misnomer, or it might be a misnomer, because one might argue that it's actually more of a colonial struggle between two different peoples or two different states. But for argument's sake, let's just say that it's a revolution. I would go ahead and say it is, because according to the criteria that I mentioned, there was a just cause, there were various rights violations, and there was a legitimate authority that had a fair amount of consent from the people. I think in respect to non-combatant immunity, that's a more granular question that focuses on the individual conduct of soldiers and whatnot. But I would go ahead and say, at least at first pass, that the American Revolution was justified.
Great. Thank you, Zeke. And thanks to all six of you. Incredibly impressive work, not just the depth of what each of you was doing, but collectively the breadth of the things you were looking at, the kinds of things you were looking at. It's the liberal arts on display, as it were. Undergraduate research, it is amongst the most powerful experiential learning opportunities we provide on our campus. I really believe that. It is a way for students to exercise and hone the very skills that a liberal arts education seeks to cultivate. It involves asking the right questions, working independently and with teams, being resilient and resourceful in the face of setbacks, making connections, building relationships, and learning how to draw meaningful conclusions and communicate those conclusions effectively. I can't think of a better or more timeless set of intellectual skills to instill in our graduates, and particularly at this moment in time. So to close, let me just offer my thanks, first of all, to all of our faculty advisors who have mentored and supported these students in their research, and to everyone in attendance for your interest and enthusiasm for the amazing research we just heard about. And to any students with us tonight who have not yet taken advantage of the incredible research opportunities afforded you at Dartmouth, I hope you now feel inspired to take that leap. We're holding another symposium on Monday, May 10th at 5:30 with an equally inspiring group of seniors who are eager to share their work. So if any of you would like to join us, please do. The link can be found on the Dartmouth events calendar, and we hope to see you there. Thanks again to all the presenters, and congratulations to each of you.